In the letter that the commissioner wrote to these various stakeholders, she put a very clear stake in the ground about what is important. And I will say, I can't say what our starting point was as a group, but I know that we concluded that process all in agreement that these 4 things matter the most. First, what is the evidence that PPSD has the systems to progress monitor academic outcomes in their schools and leverage practices that we know work to improve outcomes in PPSD schools? And what's the evidence that the board as a governance team is focused on student outcomes? That was the first priority that she communicated. Second priority is governance. So what was the evidence that the PPSD school board will continue to focus on student outcomes as we think about return to local control? And what's the evidence that there is a healthy, productive working relationship between the governance team at PPSD and PPSD leadership? It doesn't mean that they always need to agree, but they need to be able to work together in a way that's productive to move outcomes and opportunities for students across Providence. There was obviously a long-standing set of discussions and disagreements about what it means to properly fund PPSD. And so the commissioner was looking for evidence about how the city would ensure appropriate investments for PPSD consistent with its legal obligation. And what's the evidence that they would continue to commit to long-range facilities planning that improves students' access to new or like-new buildings across the city of Providence? And then finally, that there needed to be a clear commitment from the city council, from Rhode, from PPSD, from the PPSD board, of collaboratively working together in the interest of moving outcomes and opportunities for students and having a unified message about how that was going to happen. I just wanted to begin by setting some context here and thanking 2 groups of folks. First, based on sort of direction and expectations set by the commissioner, she asked for a collaborative group of city leaders to come together to talk about and get serious about what it would mean to return Providence Public Schools to local control. And so over the last 2-ish months, I've had an opportunity in collaboration with city leadership, city council leadership, Providence Public School Board leadership, and leadership from PPSD and Rhode to come together to get really serious about a few issues that sort of we'll introduce tonight. And I want to thank them for their work. I would say that probably folks on this team, on this working group that have been working over the last 2 months would agree with about 99% of the content that's in this presentation. And there are probably some areas where this reflects, I think, Rhode's position around the work that we feel as an SEA that we need to see moving forward. But I think we have a level of consensus around the things that are really important. I'm not sure that was true 2 months ago, and I feel much stronger and better about the position we are in today. I also just want to take a moment as I've transitioned into this new role starting on or around September 3rd. I've had a chance to really spend a lot of time in PPSD. I meet regularly with the superintendent and his leadership team. I attend their cabinet meetings, their senior leadership team meetings. I've probably visited every school and been in hundreds of classrooms since I've started. And I'm clear-eyed that there is significant more work to do. And I see a team of people who are rolling up their sleeves every day to do better for students. I'm very proud of the work that I see. I want to applaud the superintendent and his leadership team. And I think there's some real irrefutable concrete pieces of evidence to suggest that things are improving. And I know that we have significant more work to do ahead of us. Just to differentiate, I think, the ways that an SEA may sort of support and intervene in service of improving outcomes at schools and improving outcomes in the district. I just want to sort of lay out a few of the sort of mechanisms or tools that Rhode uses to support and accelerate improvement. Obviously, sort of the most intense is the state intervention and support that we provide to Providence Public Schools through the Crowley Act. There are obviously benchmarks that the commissioner needs to see that are hit in order for us to think about return to local control under the supervision and direction of this council. We have seen in the sort of media, sort of more broadly, I think a sort of incorrect statement that the intervention in Central Falls is similar to the Providence situation, and it's not, just to be very clear. That there's a really specific purpose around receivership for Central Falls relative to sort of finances. But there's an appointed board with full authority to make governance decisions for the Central Falls district, and they have full autonomy and decision-making around hiring and firing the superintendent, approving the budget, and then collaborating with district leaders to make policy. And then Brian, I won't sort of go through this more thoroughly because Brian did an exceptional job. There are other ways that Rhode will sort of support and intervene, such as sort of through school redesign and then comprehensive school support and improvement through CSI schools. And we obviously have customized touch points with LEAs, with specific schools, both charter, traditional LEAs, and state-operated LEAs in many different ways. In August of '24, this council took action based on reports and recommendations from the commissioner and reports from various entities that continued turnaround to PPSD was needed, and voted to approve the commissioner's recommendation to renew state intervention up to or through October 2027. Shortly after that decision, the commissioner communicated to various stakeholders, Mayor Smiley, city council leadership, school board leadership, PPSD leadership, the importance of coming together, rolling up our sleeves together, and to focus on what matters most. We know there has to be a committed commitment from various stakeholders around improving academic outcomes in PPSD. That is the most critical. We also have to address issues that have been long-standing around governance, as well as, sort of as reported in the media, concerns about both finances and facilities. The folks on this working group worked very hard. We didn't always agree on everything, but we worked through these issues together. And the idea was that we were supposed to convene, work together, demonstrate readiness and movement toward the enabling conditions that would facilitate return to local control, provide evidence, and report back to the council on our work. That's my job today. In the letter that the commissioner wrote to these various stakeholders, she put a very clear stake in the ground about what is important. And I will say, I can't say what our starting point was as a group, but I know that we concluded that process all in agreement that these four things matter the most. First, what is the evidence that PPSD has the systems to progress monitor academic outcomes in their schools and leverage practices that we know work to improve outcomes in PPSD schools? And what's the evidence that the board as a governance team is focused on student outcomes? That was the first priority that she communicated. Second priority is governance. So what was the evidence that the PPSD school board will continue to focus on student outcomes as we think about return to local control? And what's the evidence that there is a healthy, productive working relationship between the governance team at PPSD and PPSD leadership? It doesn't mean that they always need to agree, but they need to be able to work together in a way that's productive to move outcomes and opportunities for students across Providence. There was obviously a long-standing set of discussions and disagreements about what it means to properly fund PPSD. And so the commissioner was looking for evidence about how the city would ensure appropriate investments for PPSD consistent with its legal obligation, And what's the evidence that they would continue to commit to long-range facilities planning that improves students' access to new or like-new buildings across the city of Providence? And then finally, that there needed to be a clear commitment from the city council, from Rhode, from PPSD, from the PPSD board, of collaboratively working together in the interest of moving outcomes and opportunities for students and having a unified message about how that was going to happen. So that was our charge as a working group. My job through this presentation is just to update you quickly on where we are. Pre-intervention, I think there were a number of things that the Hopkins report showed, and then folks who had spent time in schools know to have been true. The district at the time pre-intervention lacked a unified curriculum and would had a sort of strategy around academics sort of broadly around let 1,000 flowers bloom. There wasn't clear unified curriculum, there wasn't a clear unified approach toward assessment, that likely led to high levels of variability across the system. I want to applaud the superintendent and his team. Today, the district now supports high-quality instructional materials that are fully supported by the district in all content areas and has a clear system, as I'll describe, around how to monitor student progress through assessments. We know very publicly that many of our multilingual learners did not receive the requisite services to which they were entitled. There was significant underinvestment in ESL programming, in staffing for our multilingual learners, and this of course led to federal intervention. We are proud to announce this school year that PPSD has exited DOJ, the consent decree with DOJ, and agreed to a multilingual learner settlement agreement with the Department of Justice due to their significant progress in delivering services for students and monitoring their progress. We know from the reports from Johns Hopkins and from many of our own observations.
Can I just add something there?
Yeah.
With the DOJ, we still have the newcomers being monitored, but I want to say that there were over 300 things that they were looking at. And it was an extensive amount of money that was invested. Every single teacher was trained. We paid for teachers to also get their certification. There was a lot done. This is a heavy lift, and I just want to stress it because I don't think people understand. Boston is still under. Sorry, Drew.
Please.
Because Boston. Boston is still under consent decree with the Department of Justice, and
Since 2009.
Yep, and haven't been able to get out from under it, and Providence was able to do it.
Yeah, it's a huge testament to the team, and the commissioner is correct. If you look at the number of findings, it is somewhere certainly in excess of 30 or 40 findings, maybe more, and they made significant progress, so I just want to applaud them. We know that there are major problems with facilities across the system. Sort of many schools were in disarray and suffered from really significant deferred maintenance. In the last few years, Providence has put up 5 new buildings that they've been built to new or like new. 3 additional schools have had their groundbreaking. Approximately 10 schools are in design. And under the commissioner's leadership and the superintendent's leadership, we have a new performance-based contract that now governs the day-to-day cleanings of building, which has led to significant improvements in the experience of students in their facilities. And then finally, the district lacked what I would call sort of a process for inspecting what was expected. If you as a leader expect that something's going to happen and you don't go and check on it and actually provide support, then it's likely not going to happen. Today, the district is regularly monitoring its practices through an observation tool. They're reporting that information back to the transformation officers, who are the principal supervisors, who are reporting that information back to school leaders, who are helping to coach and support their teachers. And so there's a much more sharing of information and a really clear academic strategy of how to drive improvement. This slide is intended to sort of communicate the ways in which Rhode and PPSD are partnering to monitor whether or not there is evidence or non-evidence of student progress. I'm spending my time, members of the team are spending their time virtually daily in PPSD schools or at the central office, providing coaching, coordinating supports, helping them think about progress monitoring, and the team is doing the heavy lift there. We are meeting every week where they are reporting the evidence about whether or not they are on track to meet their goals. And once a quarter, we have a progress review to really take stock about whether or not the actual evidence suggests that they are on track to meet the goals that they've suggested. Not that they feel that that's happening, but does the evidence and the student outcome data and the other information we have demonstrate that the school district is on target to meet those goals? And then we figure out how Rhode can provide support in areas that are stalled. I want to just spend a moment talking about the evidence that suggests that PPSD has momentum. This is a graph that looks at phonological skills for early readers in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. The light blue box, which is labeled F, are fall results from last school year for PPSD students. So said another way, 6% of students were at or above grade level as it relates to phonological skills in kindergarten, 10% in grade 1, 13% in grade 2, 27% in grade 3. By the conclusion of the end of the year, in kindergarten, that number was at 51%, 48%, 42%, and 52%. This is how those numbers compare to Council of Great City Schools districts. There are other large urban school districts. This is a data set of about 700,000 students. You can see where the Council of Great City Schools average, in this case in kindergarten, was at 49%. PPSD was slightly above that at 51%. Here's the part that I think is quite powerful, is that the improvement from fall to spring in virtually every grade level on virtually every measure was higher in PPSD than in the council districts. And so there was a 45% district change from fall to spring for PPSD students and a 40% increase for Council of Great City Schools. Said another way, the starting point for PPSD students in the fall may have been lower, but PPSD students made more progress than their Council of Great City School peers. This was, I'm a former first grade teacher, so phonological skills are very important to me. So too are high frequency words, which if anyone who knows anything about elementary and early literacy work knows that this is very important. We see the same pattern and trend happening in high frequency words, which is that PPSD students by the end of the year in early reading assessments are matching their Council of Great City School peers, but on virtually all indicators are showing higher growth than our Council of Great City School peers.
Just a quick question. What was the assessment tool used?
Yeah, thank you. It was iReady, which is a pretty popular formative assessment tool that's on the market.
So all of the other districts nationally use the same.
Yeah.
So you're comparing apples and apples.
Correct. That sample of 700,000 students were all Council of Great City School members districts whose students all took the same assessment.
Thank you.
Quick question.
Please.
Are you considering looking at, because we're talking about last school year, so 23, 24, I'm always interested in following those kindergartners into first,
Yes.
to second, and so forth, to see whether or not, if you measure those kids down, those kindergartners at first and second, if your baseline is going to be higher.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing in those
Okay.
weekly meetings that I was talking about in the quarterly reviews. That's exactly one of the questions that the team is preparing. I'd be happy to bring
I'd
it.
love to see that information once you get it.
I will nerd out and talk about that anytime you want.
Nerd to nerd.
Yes. Another area where I think PPSD is really leading the way is around reducing chronic absenteeism. PPSD was the school district, the traditional LEA that had the largest decline in chronic absenteeism in the last 2 years. And so I just want to applaud them for their work. We know from the data that we've analyze that when students are in school, they're more likely to perform at a higher level, and PPSD has done some remarkable work to close that gap with their, especially as compared to their state peers. And while I'm optimistic about the work that I see, and I'm very encouraged by the work that I see of the superintendent and his leadership team, I'm also acutely aware that we have far more work to do to close proficiency gaps between PPSD and state peers. And that is the work that the superintendent and his team are doing, and the work that I see happening, particularly under Dr. Dillon's leadership, who is the Chief Academic Officer of PPSD. So I just want to walk you through quickly some of the work that this collaborative working group did over the last 2 months, just to orient you to sort of where we are around the enabling conditions that will support return to local control. The first point, and if you remember that sort of the 4 points we were driving, one of the first was about governance. And so we took a look as a team using a tool produced by the Council of Great City Schools that focused on student outcomes governance and what that actually looks like. We studied the rubric together as a team, and we analyzed practices and experiences against that rubric. What's the gap between what the research says about what a high-functioning board does in the way that they behave and act versus the current experiences to identify where there may need to be rooms for improvement. We considered the current state versus the desired and future state, and identified the sort of gaps in both strengths and the gaps that we wanted to see, that we needed to see closed in terms of governance practices. In collaboration with the city, and I want to thank our city partners who have been rolling up their sleeves right alongside Rhode to address this, we are in the process of planning a multi-day retreat very early in the tenure of the new PPSD board that is very intentionally going to start to focus on what does it mean when a board highlights and focuses its work on student outcomes. We've also agreed to deliver year-long professional development to the board in these different modules, and I think both symbolically important and also just from like from a strength and asset perspective, members of the City of Providence and PPSD are co-leading those modules for the board, demonstrating their ability to support together and to illustrate that to the new governance team. And the mayor, of course, has many variables that he needs to consider as he looks at and makes final decisions about which 5 candidates he will select to represent the different neighborhoods of Providence. But he will consider sort of their commitment and interest in student governance, our student-focused outcomes, as one element of the things that he considers in making those appointments, as well as thinking about the professional learning and coaching orientation of members that are in the candidate pool for that. You have probably read a lot about the financial concerns and disagreements between the city and PPSD. I just want to take a moment to sort of like paint a portrait of sort of the legal questions, and then we'll talk a little bit about the settlement agreement, which I think, while both parties probably are happy about different elements of it, both parties probably have some concerns about it, I think it was a really fair compromise that really positions PPSD well, and I'll try to walk the council through that. But all of this stemmed from 2 separate legal actions that were taken by the City of Providence against the commissioner, suggesting that she did not have the right to withhold money in support of PPSD. And there were 2 matters, one related to FY24 and FY25, that were before a Superior Court judge, Judge Lamphere. After several hearings and testimony from different witnesses, the judge did rule in favor of the commissioner that she was right to call out that the city was not meeting its legal obligation to fund PPSD under Crowley, and that she had a right to withhold dollars in service of providing resources to PPSD. The judge confirmed that PPSD's calculations for maintenance of effort were accurate, and was on the verge of making a ruling of how much money would be awarded to PPSD as a result of these legal cases. Credit to the city leadership and PPSD leadership and Rhode leadership, who over a series of days and long hours worked through a settlement agreement, which I will quickly walk you through. Given its failure to meet Crowley, the city agreed to pay PPSD $4 million for FY24. That money, assuming that any gap that existed in 2024 could have been resolved through surplus or ESSER dollars, that money could be applied to sort of future years as needed. In FY25, the city agreed to pay PPSD $11 million, which closed the $10.9 million gap that the superintendent had very passionately structural deficit that the superintendent had very clearly articulated to the community would lead to a number of cuts across PPSD. The city has agreed to fund PPSD for FY26 at $147 million and has agreed to fund PPSD at $147 million plus the percentage it owes PPSD and an increase in state aid. One of the many reasons why I think this is important is that this provides continuity and clarity to PPSD leadership about what their funding situation is going to be over the next few years, such that they are not going to be battling and having arguments with the city about what the appropriate funding needs to be, and that they can focus on the right work at the right time. I think that this is good news, and I think that this positions PPSD better today than it did yesterday. And we will also acknowledge that these investments are still below what would be expected of the city under Crowley. Also related to sort of resources under finances is the importance of new or like new buildings across Providence. And so the commissioner has set a goal for PPSD student access to new or like new buildings. That goal is by 2030, the city will provide access to new or like new buildings for all PPSD students. Under the leadership of Rhode's Chief Operating Officer, Rhode has presented a potential path to achieve that goal to both the mayor's office and city council, and is hopeful that we will be able to meet that goal. If for some reason city leadership does not think they can meet that goal, or that timeline or the amount of money that will be required to deliver on that timeline is not feasible, then the city must submit a plan outlining a timeline and pathway to achieving that goal to the commissioner for her review.
Yeah, and I just want to, so that everybody knows what you're talking about, Mario put together a fiscal plan on how the buildings can be done, and everybody here knows that Mario's very precise.
Thank you, Commissioner. And then finally, which I think is a really important, it might feel a little squishy for folks, but I think this idea of adults working together in service of improvements of academic outcomes and opportunities for Providence students is very critical. And we had a really set of frank conversations about what the barriers were to collaboration and trust, what's been the impact of those decisions or those barriers, what's the evidence, and what needs to change to dramatically improve collaboration and trust. And we've agreed to a number of commitments as a sort of working group that we hope all entities will commit to as we continue to pursue this work moving forward. That one, we have an expectation as a team that we're going to center youth and families in our collective conversations, that we have to do more to determine the right cadence of regular communication between and among the city council, PPSD school board, PPSD and Rhode leadership. We have clear roles and responsibilities and ensure that our meetings foster productivity and partnership. We need to make sure that we're engaged in proactive communication outside of crisis. And we need to make sure that we're coordinating and sharing information with each other about events, press conferences, important looming decisions, and or when projects or initiatives cannot be complete on a timeline that's been mutually agreed upon. And then finally, I think the team agrees that there are 3 big areas of work where we could really improve our communication around finances, facilities, and academic outcomes. And we really should build out sort of communication charts and flow charts to help us make sure that the right people at the right time know this information. So I'll just conclude with I'm just speaking for myself, sort of my final reflections here. I think there's significant momentum happening in PPSD. I'm encouraged by the quantitative data that I see. I'm encouraged by the qualitative data that I see with my own eyes and my own ears from the time that I've spent in the district. I'm encouraged by the district and school leadership. The superintendent cares deeply about the children and families of Providence, and he is doing everything he can with his team to drive improvements. And I am very encouraged by the leadership of Dr. Dillon to ensure an ambitious teaching and learning plan across PPSD. I also remain very clear-eyed that there is significant work for us to do. And while I think it is very feasible to happen on the timeline that the council has set, I know that we have to roll up our sleeves and do this work together. And if we can't figure out a way to do that, there will continue to be barriers to delivering on a promise of excellence and equity for children in Providence. Happy to take any questions that you all might have and to come back at a later date with more information as we continue to do this
Can
work.
I just add something before we
Please.
take questions? If you recall, the school board's report talked about certain things that this presentation was meant to address some of those areas. And we're very happy that Dr. Dillon is in Providence because there was a need to kind of structure the teaching and learning piece a little differently. And you see that happening now, which is very exciting. And one other piece, that interventions are happening throughout the nation, state interventions, and many of them see great results, but the biggest pitfall is if you don't plan for it to return. Because what's happened in many places, we've seen it in Rhode, we've seen it in Canada, we've seen it in many different places where there's immense progress and then it goes back in 2 or 3 years and it's back in the same place. So our hope is that as we move the district forward, it is all these entities that have to demonstrate that they have the ability to sustain the efforts. That means funding, that means the board, that means that PPSD continues to move in that direction. So that's what this is really about. And like I said, we're having this conversation also at the national level, like how they're looking at what we're doing with hopes, and there are other colleagues of mine that are doing similar things, and we're just really committed to not letting the districts fall back to where they were.
So I'm really happy to hear about this kind of planning. I think that's really critical. When you mentioned the evidence a lot in this presentation, and I'm curious, I think you just mentioned the critical players, right? So who all is making up the work that I'm interested in knowing who's present, so that all of those entities are represented. And secondly, as I look at your slide on unified voice, there are a lot of commitments here. And when you talk about evidence, are you planning some kind of evidence against each of these bullets? How are you and what are you collecting relative to the evidence, both quantitative and qualitative, that you'll use?
Yeah.
Who all's involved?
Yes. Let me take your first question. As it relates to the collaborative working group, I don't know if that was the sort of question about who was involved there. We had representatives from the city council staff, senior leadership from city council, senior representatives from Mayor Smiley's administration, senior representatives from PPSD, including the superintendent, chief of staff, chief academic officer, deputy superintendent, senior level folks from Rhode, including Christopher Redden, Maureen Dizon, and me, and one member of the Providence School Board. They only identified one member, Melissa Hughes. And so we were sort of working together as a team. Separate from that, under the commissioner's leadership, we are meeting with senior level PPSD folks in 4 major areas. Folks that are helping to drive academic outcomes, folks who are working on issues around chronic absenteeism, folks who are working on HQIM implementation, particularly in literacy. What does the actual work look like in classrooms? And then finally, data inquiry cycles and continuous improvement plans at schools. They are updating us based on information that they have from academic information around the iReady assessment, around the observational tools of going into classrooms to look at instructional practice. They are letting us know the degree to which they are on target to meet those goals with evidence. And then they are sharing that information when they leave our table here in this room. They then go to their transformation officers. They share that same information with their transformation officers so they can dig into their individual schools, who then bring that information back to the schools that they supervise.
So at some point, it would be great to see some examples of that.
Sure.
I would love to see that. The second question, are you involving the teachers, teacher representation, the Providence Teachers Union, in any level of these folks that you're meeting with?
We are obviously meeting with PTU leadership through the negotiations process.
Yeah, and then separate part.
And then I am meeting with the superintendent and his teacher leaders sort of cabinet on a regular basis, but they are not involved in analyzing the data. They are involved at the school level with their principal and their tier.
And with the district level, does work with the teachers union on all these kind of things.
Because where I was, negotiations aside, my question was really related to the question I asked you about the metrics, if you will, the evidence, and these, what I think to be very important commitments that you've made. Important to have, I would suggest to you, very important to have the voice of the teachers represented in these kinds of discussions.
It's a very good point. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel hopeful. This is just really great collaborative work, and I appreciate you presenting this.
Thank you all for your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you.